Hello, my name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation to today's program on Jews in Jamaica finding safe harbor. Every Sunday, or almost every Sunday for the past 2 years, we've been running these programs on stories of rescue, resistance, refugees, hopeful stories, and today is a fascinating story on a very old Jewish presence in Jamaica, which was a land that offered refuge to Jews over many centuries. It's a story most people don't know. Our foundation is devoted to the hero Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was the Portuguese consul general in Bordeaux, France during World War II. And some of the people that he saved ended up in Jamaica, and that's part of the story we will hear today. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce today's moderator, Professor Shulamit Reinharz of Brandeis University. She's a sociologist and an expert on so many topics. And Shula, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. Soon you will hear from two speakers about the beautiful and history-rich island of Jamaica. Our presentation, as Olivia Mattis said, is called Jews in Jamaica, Finding Safe Harbor. That's a play on the word harbor. They found a safe place to go to, and it's in the water. The first of our two speakers is the incredible, energetic, dynamic Ainsley Henriquez, whose family has lived in Jamaica for generations. Ainsley Henriquez has taken many roles over the years in leading the Jewish community, Jamaican Jewish community, and he will explain the country's Jewish history. Thank you so much, Ainsley, for making your presentation available to us. And our second speaker, when Ainsley has completed providing us with the context for today's talk, is a specific instance of Jews finding safe harbor in Jamaica. And that will be presented by Joan Arnay Halperin, who works on the Educational Initiatives Committee of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, but also is the part of the family who was actually rescued on that island. So I think you should be called an honorary Jamaican, Joan. So let's start with a few slides that show you a little bit about Jamaica. Jamaica is an island, and it is within the Caribbean Sea, as probably many of you know. The most important place for our presentation today is Kingston, which is in the south, right on the water. And it was in Kingston that our story unfolds. Next slide, please. Here is an example of the Jamaican Jews in Shul. And what you see here is a woman wearing a talit and a kippah, so you know it's a liberal or progressive synagogue. You see people who are white, people who are of mixed ethnicity. You see the raising of the Torah on the bima in a synagogue, which is called Shaare Shalom, and which welcomes all the people of Jamaica who were born to Jews or who were converted into Judaism. And what's interesting also about this picture is if you see on the top of the two wooden holders of the Torah, you see rimonim. Those are the silver metallic pomegranates, which have little bells hanging from them to make the entry of the Torah into our service full of sweet tinkling sounds. Next slide, please. And here we have my favorite photograph of Jewish Jamaica. We have a Jewish woman, leader of the choir, with people around her, a man with a kippah, a man without a kippah, again, mixed ethnicity. She is belting out the Kiddush. Next one. And the last slide of mine is the Tashlich ceremony, which happens right around the time of Rosh Hashanah. You see a mixed group of people, and these people probably have just thrown bread into the water to cast away their sins. I think it took place afterwards because I don't see any bread in the picture. But their sins are not very many, and I'm sure they took care of that very quickly. And so we are now going to see an iconic picture of the Jamaican Jewish community. This is a synagogue with a sand floor. If you look closely, you will see footprints in the sand. And this harkens back to the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula, where Jews hid both by being unseen, but also by being unheard. And in order to make sure that nobody heard that they were conducting a service in the basements of their homes, they put sand on the floor. So it has nothing to do with the sand of Jamaica. It has to do with the sand of Spain and Portugal. There are 6 synagogues in the world that have these sand floors, and they're all, I think, except one in the Caribbean. And now I'm going to turn the slide over to Mr. Jamaica, who once was married to Miss Jamaica, truly, and has a lot to teach us today. Welcome, Ainsley.
Thank you, Shula. That was really wonderful. And of course, I could not start without identifying my mother, my Ima, who made it to 100 years in the front of that Taklit gathering. So that little 5-foot individual came out of many, many, many generations, and I would not ethnicities and nations. And so I'm going to talk to that in a little while. But first, welcome to everybody. And I'm going to talk about only 367 years of an interesting Jewish history over 4 chapters. Now, don't be afraid, chapters are not long chapters, they're short. But first, a brief background. England captured my island home from the Colon family in 1655. It was the family of Christopher Columbus. Columbus first visited the island in 1494, and then lived here on his 4th voyage until he was rescued and lived here for over a year. We can argue that he was our first living tourist. Most of the generation of the people, the people who were found here, the Taino people, the indigenous people, died over the next decade due to European diseases and also enforced labor. So until 160 years ago, when the English arrived, the population was estimated at less than 3,000. Why so few was that we had not been blessed nor subjected to or enjoyed deposits of gold and silver. We had no such treasure.
Ainsley, can we see your first slide? Because it shows exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Those the early times. Okay.
And those markers were usually created and carved in England because that stone was not available in Jamaica. So that's an interesting story. We had a very close relationship with the English Jewish community of Bevis Marks, and we still practice our services using the Gasta prayer book from Bevis Marks with some slight modifications. So this gives us a little bit more to understand. But again, I want to come back to the question of the population did not experience the Spanish Catholic Inquisition. And so quite honestly, when the British or the English captured Jamaica, more than half of the people did not flee. They must have had converso ancestry or origin. So that's an interesting position to have had. The English needed to protect the island for the use of the harbor. And we talked about harbor at the beginning of this program. It's the 7th largest in the world. And it began to attract settlers. They started to attract settlers and build the forts to protect the harbor and the coast from the Spanish and French invasions likely to have taken place again. Jews, mainly Portuguese, started to arrive from Amsterdam, from Holland, and some subsequently from England as they moved from Amsterdam into England and started to migrate to Jamaica. A town was ultimately created named Port Royal with the return of the monarchy in England. Cromwell had removed them and had become a friend of Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, hence us being allowed to settle in Jamaica. Quite an interesting relationship between the English and a Jewish rabbi in Amsterdam. Synagogue was built there, and we know this from the record of its destruction in the earthquake of 6 June 1692. We eventually moved after that to settle in the Spanish capital, San Diego de la Vega, now known as Spanish Town. And there we started building a new synagogue in the style of Bevis Marks in London. That ruin is underground, and we have looked at restoring it through archaeological work. So the first chapter is why did we leave our homelands to flee to Holland, then England and the New World? It's based on anti-Semitism. So that is what I've termed the chapter, the first chapter, which is on anti-Semitism. Before I comment, I'd like to read very briefly a section from this week's parashah commentary by Rabbi Peter Tarlow of Texas. And that is simply to say, he condenses anti-Semitism across the ages succinctly. This year, the month of April represents the highs and lows of Jewish history. We have now finished our yearly celebration of Passover and our liberation from Egyptian slavery. Now, a week later, we remember the tragedies of the European experience, an experience that lasted some 2,000 years and was brutal exile on blood-soaked continent filled with beautiful art and unimaginable tragedies. Perhaps this historical roller coaster is best represented by the name of this week's Torah portion, Arichai Mot, after the death of. I won't speak to the story of the Ukraine because I think we all know it well, but I will speak later on the fact that I am a quarter Ukrainian. Which quarter I'm not going to admit. Because my grandmother was born in the Ukraine. So we should expand the day to remember not only those Jews who were murdered by the Nazis, but all the millions of other Jews murdered in Europe over the last 2 millennia. Yom HaShoah reminds us that for the last 2,000 years, we have been the victims of European slander. Europeans have accused us of everything from being too aggressive to too passive, from being too wealthy to too poor, from being too business-minded to being too academic. We were and are Europe's punching bag, its eternal victims. Today, with the rise of new European anti-Semitism, many Europeans resent the fact that we no longer refuse to play the role of victims. Tragically, anti-Semitism is very much alive and well in Europe. From the French court system that finds every excuse not to punish perpetrators of the anti-Semitic acts, to the British university system where racism has become almost acceptable, to the European soccer where fans often use anti-Semitic taunts, and anti-Semitism in Europe is alive and well. This week's Torah portion, Acharai Mot, means after death and refers to Aaron's sons, but perhaps a better translation would be after the murder of. Aaron moved on with his life, but he must have felt his son's death until his last days. We too must move on with the collective life of the Jewish people, but the trauma of anti-Semitism will remain forever. How do you handle this trauma? And I can add, one answer is to live in Israel, another is to find a Jamaica. So let's move on. Simply.
Would you like the next slide?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Let me share briefly my genealogy as it relates to anti-Semitism, because this is an important concept of why we came. We didn't come here because there was no anti-Semitism. We came here because there was anti-Semitism from the 17th century that we were able to find Jamaica as a home to visit, to live in. My father's family with the name Henriquez came via Holland from Portugal. Visit Belmonte, for example, And the numbers of the names will be amazing. Smith in England may only come second in numbers. The family records include connecting with many other Sephardic Portuguese families, Melhedo, Depaz, etc. My mother's history, which I've just pointed out to her, is different. Sephardic, yes, in one major connection. She's a descendant of the Belinfanti family who fled from Portugal to Istanbul and eventually became rabbis again in Europe. And the son of one of the rabbis in Amsterdam arrived in the mid-18th century as a Hebrew teacher to Jamaica. So you get an understanding now from that how long we have been practicing Judaism to the extent where we have employed a Hebrew teacher. She also descends from a Czechoslovakian migrants and from her Ukrainian-born mother who fled in the 1890s from a village in Ukraine to Philadelphia, where my grandfather from Jamaica met her and brought her here, where she lived in peace as a practicing Jewess for over 60 years. But in Jamaica, she was not able to practice the kosher that she grew up with, who had been a very Orthodox family in a village in the Ukraine. So my genealogy is living proof to the understanding of what Jews have faced with anti-Semitism that has caused us to seek a safe life over these nearly 4 centuries in the Caribbean. Yes, in fact, 366 years. Now we come to a second chapter, assimilation. The English were encouraged or forced who came to stay and populate the island. Why? No gold. So they saw that the Spanish had grown sugarcane and made sugar. Interesting that Spanish sugar mill has been found and is restored under my watch as chairman of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. But we do not as yet show it off. And why? It's perhaps because it encouraged future enslavement. So with the goals of plantation, sugar cane, and the boiling to make slavery was started. People in mainly the countries in the west of Africa were captured or sold as slave traders and were brought to the Americas to be sold as to slave owners for the use in mainly agricultural production. This took place in Jamaica too. Over time, some escaped and settled in remote areas. Some were freed, or as it was termed, manumitted and allowed to live free lives. Jews and former free Africans or free former Africans and others, however, were not classified as English citizens until 1831. So who were they and how did this range of ethnicities and religious beliefs relate? Interestingly, as our motto today speaks, that we are many out of many, one people. And that tells a very interesting story on the way that we have been able to handle the assimilation process and live in Jamaica with equal recognition of who we are. In some cases, fleeing anti-Semitism, women and children were sent out first. As today in the Ukraine or in the early migrations from Europe, in others as well, men went first to find jobs and homes. As in the case of my grandmother, whose father went first to America and then sent for his wife and child. In Jamaica, our information is that men came looking, and a part of their looking, as I term it, found women. So the bottom line today is that we estimate that there are probably as many as 400,000 Jamaicans with Jewish ancestry. That's quite a story. As Jamaica is a strongly Christian country and Jews do not convert people to become Jewish readily, most Jews from mixed relationships joined the Christian faith, and so did their children. One classic example of this in my lifetime was the leader of the Jewish community and the Archbishop of the Anglican discipline of Christianity. They were cousins. I knew them both, and they stayed friends and cousins. So the proof of assimilation through the ages was there. Between both people of different ethnicities and beliefs, we survived. Let me add the proof from my own life. Returning from university and living there as a practicing Jew, and once in love with a Jewish woman, I fell in love with an incredible Jewish woman from mixed ethnicities and a strong believing Catholic family, as we have just heard. Interestingly, while studying at university in Boston, she lived with a Jewish doctor and his wife and their young children for her years there. We took the decision to marry 60 years ago. Not an easy decision based on both our family histories. However, peace finally settled us. And one day she simply said that she possibly knew more about Judaism than I did. And so she arranged with the rabbi to convert. And yes, our 3 daughters attended a religious Jewish wedding on our 10th anniversary, conducted by the rabbi. All my family and hers and our friends, regardless of their religious beliefs, were also there, numbering some 200, as I recall. It was quite a wedding. Our lives were totally and wonderfully stimulated, and together she worked with me across the Caribbean on issues of Jewish concern until her passing. And yes, she's buried in the Jewish cemetery. My other experience is my second wife, who is listening to what I'm saying now, from a similar mixed ethnicity and a non-Jewish religious background. She was the major contributor to the Museum of Jewish Heritage that we created in our synagogue premises that encouraged tours of who we are in Jamaica, as well as an educational facility and a deterrent to anti-Semitism. And now we come to the post-1831, which I call evolution. We now had become full citizens. And as we emerged, a lot of changes took place in what we were able to do. We could offer our services now to work in government and be elected to the legislature of the country. In the first elections, a study of who we voted for, of who voted for the Jews, or Jews who stood for office, were determined by the free and recognized free peoples of color, of mixed ethnicity, who were the majority that supported Jews for offices. And yes, we were elected and even had enough Jews elected to the legislature that they closed the legislature on Yom Kippur.
Ainsley, would you like to include some of your other slides, because we only have 2 more minutes for your presentation?
I'll just finish it quickly now, because I think one of the things I wanted to do was to finish that with the evolution. Our members studied to become doctors, dentists, lawyers. Later were quiet numbers. We became successful merchants and active, even becoming owners of plantation and sugar factories and in construction. One activity that my grandfather and his brothers created was the first Jamaica match factory. After independence, our first appointment of an ambassador from Jamaica was a prominent lawyer who was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, Sir Neville Ashenheim. He was Jamaica's first ambassador to the United States, and yes, he was a prominent Jew. The first appointed Jew to the Senate was Isaac Matalon, my stepfather, and his brother succeeded him subsequently and was elected and became a minister of a number of government positions. So this is part of it. My pleasure has been to have been elected and appointed to different numbers of various public positions. And today I'm the continuing chairman of the Norman Manley Foundation. So it's really quite an honor to have that kind of recognition and to be able to provide that story for the bulk of the future generations. So after 191 years, we have been evolved to become an integrated community, and assimilation worked. Migration, however, has caused hundreds of us to leave Jamaica to find succession in retirement homes, and also from young children, young people going to university, to colleges, and finding opportunities that does not encourage them to come back. And I have to admit that I have 3 daughters for the same, that have done that to me and done it for themselves. And I want to share one other very important example. Rabbi Henry Pereira Mendes of Shaare Israel recognition and success. I was born from a rabbi who was born in Montego Bay. And that's, again, part of our interesting contribution to Judaism, not only in Jamaica, but across the world. And I could add much more. However, what is very interesting, and I'll share this last point with you, his aunt was my great-great-grandmother. And that's how I became so fascinated by the history of our Jewish people in the Caribbean and generally throughout the world. So,
would you like to show the slides or not?
No, there's nothing. I'm about to finish because I really was exposed to the horror of Europe through the experiences of my adopted Polish family in London. And this is where Joan comes in, because Miriam, who was in the Gibraltar camp with her family, was able to flee Paris and were housed there, eventually was able to leave the Jamaica and go to England to marry her intended. They became my otherwise family in England, and I spent 5 years living in their home on and off throughout my sojourn in Europe. I know the Gibraltar camp story probably more intimately than anybody, either dead or alive. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I look forward to Joan's contribution, and shalom, shalom.
Shalom, Ainsley, and thank you so much. Our second speaker is Joan Arnay Halperin, whom I mentioned before. She has written a book. It's titled My Sister's Eyes, a family chronicle of rescue and loss during World War II, which begins where Ainsley has left off. Joan has a very complicated story to tell us. Like everything else in Jamaica, it's very complicated. Her story touches on many countries. I list Germany, Poland, Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, Malta, and Jamaica. All have a role in this story. She's not going to discuss everything. And she's going to tell us about something that Ainsley just mentioned, which is something that was new to me. It's called the Gibraltar Camp. And it was located in Kingston on a site which then became the University of the West Indies. And it was located there while Jamaica was a British colony. So the Brits made all the decisions about the arrival of these people. Joan will explain how it was that her parents were rescued from Europe in 1942, which is when all the deportations were going full blast from all the countries where Jews lived into the concentration camps. And her family was given shelter in Jamaica. She wasn't born yet. What was it like in that shelter called the Gibraltar Camp? And what are some of the controversies that arose there? After Joan's presentation, I will ask them a couple of questions that you have put in the chat room. Please remember that we have a very large audience today, and I won't be able to get to all of the questions, but I will get to some. And if you have questions that are not answered, I would like to make a recommendation that you go down to Jamaica for a vacation, and while you're there, you email Ainsley to ask him if you could visit him. And he will tell you everything that you will not have learned today. And that's exactly what I did in December. I called him up and I said, Ainsley, I would like to meet you. And he spent the day showing us everything and telling us stories. So now let's go to Joan Arnay Halperin.
Okay, as I said to Shula and Ainsley, when we were, working on this program, Ainsley needs 5 programs all by himself. But, and maybe Olivia will accommodate us because we really need to hear more and more and more from Ainsley, Mr. Jamaica. In any case, my story starts like this. In the first slide, please. Here are my parents, Hala and Ignash Krakowiak, with my sister Yvonne on the Belgian coast in the summer of 1939. And in the next slide. On May the 10th in 1940, Hitler invades the lowlands. In mid-May, the Krakowiak family of 6 persons flees Belgium by car. They drive to Bordeaux, France, where they receive visas to Portugal from Aristides de Sousa Mendes and arrive in Portugal in late June. And this is our hero, Aristides de Sousa Mendes. In the next slide. Here are my parents, the Krakowiak family, as refugees in Figueira da Foz, Portugal. My uncle Hipek with his name above him. My Aunt Zosha. Hipek was my father's brother. Zosha, his wife. Then Hala, my mother. Ignash, my father. And my sister, Yvonne. This must be February 1941 because she's wearing a Mardi Gras dress and they are standing in front of the iconic lighthouse of the fortress of Santa Catarina.
Joan, may I just say, all of these people had come from Poland to Belgium before they came down to Bordeaux.
I don't know the two ladies on the sides, but they must have been in Belgium in order to flee on May the 10th when the bombs started to fall. My parents were Polish Jews living in Belgium, and my uncle Hipek and Zosha as well, Polish Jews living in Belgium. In the next slide. This is an article in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. It says the JDC arranges emigration of Polish Jewish refugees from Lisbon to Jamaica. I have a red arrow pointing to emigration. You'll understand why later in this speech, in this talk. And I'm going to read this article. January the 12th, 1942, New York. Emigration from Portugal to the British island of Jamaica of 180 stranded Polish Jewish refugees has been made possible through the collaboration of the Joint Distribution Committee with the British and Polish governments. The refugees who have been stranded in Lisbon for periods of up to a year and a half would have remained stranded if the JDC had not come to their help because all previous efforts to secure overseas visas for them had failed. In the next slide, please. Here they are, my mother, my father, my mother, and Yvonne on the train from Figueira da Foz to Lisbon to catch the ship, the Serpa Pinto. And I have this excerpt or small piece of the manifest from the JDC for the Serpa Pinto. And you'll notice that they use their Jewish names. So the number 77, Frindla, was my grandmother. But my mother told me Frindla was never at Gibraltar camp. So I don't know where she went. She was supposed to be on the ship, and I don't really know 100% where she ended up, except in the United States after a while. Then my mother, then my father, then Yecheskel was my uncle Hipek, Zosha, and number 82, I marked Yvonne, my sister, who was 3 years old. And I also want you to see number 83, Charles Krischer, who was 3 years old, and he becomes important again later in the story. In the next slide, please. Well, here they are. This is a photo of Gibraltar Camp, Kingston, Jamaica, in November of 1940, when it was created for Gibraltarians. That means British citizens living on the Rock of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean. Michael, do you want to enlarge that slide, please? Go a little bigger on the camp. It was a army-style camp with army-style barracks, surrounded by barbed wire. And as Ainsley pointed out to me, we don't know, probably it was to keep people out and not to keep the evacuees in, because the evacuees were allowed to leave the camp and they had a curfew. They needed to return at 10:30 or 11 p.m. every night, but they were allowed to leave the camp. This was shocking. This was shocking to the refugees, the Jewish refugees, the Jewish Polish refugees. When they arrived in Jamaica, they had no idea that they weren't going to be emigrating, as it was stated in the JTA article. Later on, we'll hear much more about that. Next slide, please. They arrived on February 8th, approximately February, some say 7th, some say 8th. And by February 28th, they were already organized, these Polish Jews, into a committee. And this committee, if you see here, February 28th, 1942, from S. Rosenbaum, he was the president of the committee, I imagine, Gibraltar Camp 2, the Polish group, to the Polish government in exile in London. And here, are some excerpts from that very long 8-page letter. We were not aware of the conditions under which we were to live here. When we left Lisbon, we were told we were going to a free country to live as free men with the possibility of building up our lives again. We object to the feeling of having to live for the duration of the war on charge of public charity. Therefore, we beg you to find a way that a visa should be granted to us to such country where we could really immigrate and make ourselves useful. Here you have a picture that I took from the JDC archives. I hope I'm allowed to do that. I'm not making money on this program, so I'm using their picture. Here are some of the refugees in the Polish group. And you see they look very, very nicely starched, beautiful shirts, and everybody looks very starched. We have a daughter of somebody from the camp. I think the two little children are the mother and the sister of one of our participants today, Miss Cox. I forgot her first name, Aronofsky Cox, and she'll probably want to say something in the chat, and we can talk about her sister there. Here are the barracks in which they lived. Each cubicle was 10 feet square. They were furnished with 2 cots. They were furnished with a table, 2 chairs, and mosquito nets, especially mosquito nets, very important. Also, these are the wash basins, which I believe they used to wash their clothes in. These are remnants of plantation days, because Gibraltar camp was situated on the former sugar plantation called sometimes Pepin in the beginning, and the Mona sugar plantation. Next, please. They had their meals in a outdoor setting with covered with open walls. Everything had to be open. Even in the barracks, the cubicles had partitions of 1.5 meters, not 1 meter, 1.5 centimeters thick. I read this in a report, and they were 9 feet high. So just because you had to have all the air circulating all the time. And then eventually some of the Jewish women were allowed to go to the kitchen and make challah for the group. So you heard the first complaint by the Polish group, and here on March I've only chosen a few of the very, very many records that the HISM has at the Jewish Historical Society in Manhattan. But on March the 20th in 1942, from Mr. Bernard Glasscheib from the Gibraltar camp to Mr. Ilya Dejour of the HISM in New York, New York. By the way, Ilya Dejour received a visa from Sousa Mendes as well, in any case. He says, dear Miss, and he's writing in French, dear Mr. Dejour, the weeks are passing, and I tell you frankly and personally in the name of the others that discouragement is beginning to overtake us, this terrible idleness in this climate. What they were complaining about was they had nothing to do. They were sitting there fighting, complaining about each other. You got more, I got less. These are things that my mother told me. Okay, and the idleness was already overcoming them. And here's my mother and my father. The way of only one of two photos that they have from the camp. And this is what I'm reading to you now is a testimony from my mother's 1989 interview. It was very hot there. The partitions of the cubicles didn't reach the ceiling, and when you sneezed, your neighbor would say, Gesundheit. We weren't used to the style of food they served, so Daddy planted a vegetable garden to supplement our meals. Everything grew so well there. And then she said, Daddy got a job at Jamaica College, replacing the British gymnastics instructor who had been called to war. Daddy was so proud that his Maccabee sport training would be useful. He bought a bicycle so that he didn't have to take the bus. He needed to be independent. Now, if you put the slide down, thank you. I have a few notes to read from the report that Mr. Charles M. Jordan, director of the JDC of the Caribbean area, made to the JDC in New York on December 17 in 1942. About the climate, he said, the camp was located in a large meadow surrounded by gently rolling wooded hills. The breezes blow most of the time. Well, he was there in December. He wasn't there in June, July, and August. Commandant Ray, a remarkable man, a strict disciplinarian, but at the same time tolerant and understanding and absolutely fair and just. This is the opinion of many, many people who were at Gibraltar camp. The commandant was a fair and just man. It is not my opinion from my personal family experience. And then he said the cubicles were equipped like a hotel room. The hospital was well equipped. The food, he said about the food, he said nothing left to be desired except kosher meat. Okay. My personal experience is that that bicycle that my father bought to be independent and go to his work at Jamaica College, because he was one of the only refugees who were allowed to work, was the cause of the accident that took my sister's life. I don't have time here to go into that story, but I ask you kindly to go to my website where you can read my, my book for free in the form of a PDF, and you will get the whole story about her accident. But I must read to you what Charles Krischer, the boy of 3, said when I interviewed him for my book. When she didn't come back from the infirmary, it was a tremendous shock to us. When we were older, our parents told us that Yvonne died of sepsis, a result of her injury from the bicycle accident. Even though Ignash begged on bended knees, the commandant would not move her to a regular hospital where they might have saved her with better medical treatment. It wasn't a question of money. Other refugee friends would have chipped in, but the willful commandant refused. I can't imagine my father begging anybody on bended knees. If anybody knew my father, they would not be able to imagine him begging for the life of his child. But that's what Charles, his parents, told him. Now, if my time is up, my time is up.
I'm sorry, Joan. I think both Ainsley and Joan, you can tell, are wonderful storytellers and have so much more to share. But they're not going anywhere. You can find them. So now I would like to switch the camera back on to Olivia, who will talk to us about the future presentations.
Okay, so very quickly, we have some fabulous programs upcoming for you. Next Sunday is Mother's Day, and we have a Mother's Day themed program called Mothers of Exile, and it's a salute to Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty, and to Emma Lazarus, who wrote the poem, The New Colossus, that's on the Statue of Liberty. The following week, we have a program called Saving Italy, and there we're looking at the Nazi spoliation of art in Italy. And for that program, we're going to be showing you a film, and that film is called Stealing Italy, and we have a little trailer for you now.
It's 1944, July. German Wehrmacht troops in Italy, using trucks just like this one, empty a villa that contains hundreds of the most important masterpieces in the great Florence museums. Things worth more than $1 billion. It was one of the great art thefts in history. Some of those works are still missing today.
At the end of World War II, the Allies made a series of shocking discoveries. Hidden in trains, bunkers, and deep underground, they found mountains of stolen treasure.
That must have been like going into Aladdin's cave.
Hitler and the Nazis had looted an entire continent and committed the greatest theft in history. Now, a team of investigators is opening up cold case files of Nazi plunder still missing today.
We're talking about things that are worth tens of millions of dollars.
Robert Edsel is an expert in Nazi-looted treasure.
Hundreds of thousands of objects are still missing. Well, we have a lot of digging to do.
Joining him is Second World War historian James Holland.
None of this was really his. He'd just taken it.
And investigative journalist Connor Woodman.
And this is a genuine treasure hunt. We dig a hole in the ground and we find those cases.
Their mission, uncover new clues.
Oh gosh, this is it.
Explore Nazi hideouts.
Whoever built this brick wall really didn't want anyone to get through to the other side.
Find out how the treasure was stolen and where it might be now.
What a piece of history.
So look for an email later today with information about how to sign up for these programs. Shula, why don't you answer some or moderate the Q&A with audience questions now?
Okay. Thank you, Olivia. Many people have written in to say how much they enjoyed Joan and Ainsley and how much more time they would like to speak with you. We tried to cram everything into an hour, so our apologies for not giving them even more time. So here are some questions. Ainsley, for you, one question. Were there Jewish people who were slave owners or slave masters? We know you grew up on a plantation. You knew that you grew up at a time where there was no electricity and no modern conveniences. Tell us in a word or two, were there Jewish slave owners?
Yes, there were. And there were slave owners, there were former enslaved people who were also slave owners. So the whole concept of slavery did not stop only with the plantation owner. And in fact, a number of Jews, and if you read Eli Faber's book, which is really a most important research program published on the business of enslavement in the Caribbean and in America, the major source of his information came, I hate to admit, but from Jamaica. And he was a friend of mine. And may he rest in peace.
That does not differentiate him from anyone else, you know, in terms of being a friend. So I would like to ask you something else. Joan has talked about controversy. And you, when we met, told me about controversies among the Jews and how you worked to reduce it by bringing people together. Could you just talk about that and where the title United Congregations come from?
Well, the original Sephardic the settlers were Sephardim. And there was the first major synagogue in Spanish Town, which I mentioned, was patterned or copied after shortly after the Bismarck synagogue was created in London. Then subsequently, we had what is known as the English and German congregation. So that was another congregation that also had its own synagogue, but we all, to a certain extent, buried with each other, and we intermarried because my first ancestor of Henriquez origin married a woman named Sarah Franks. Now, I'm pretty damn sure that Sarah Franks was not a Sephardic woman. So that's another story. So I claim for many years that I'm what is called café con leche. I'm mixed of both. So that's
together. Did you bring all the people together?
Well, and what we moved forward was that towards the end of this 19th century, the English and German congregation joined with the Sephardic congregation, or the Spanish and Portuguese congregation. And 100 years ago, we celebrated that 100th anniversary 4 weeks ago. That 100th anniversary of togetherness became the United Congregation of Israelites. And we no longer call ourselves Spanish and Portuguese or English and German. And we then ended up with one synagogue, which you saw pictures of. And that was also part, I was not around 100 years ago, but I maintained that relationship for the subsequently in my life as president, etc. So yes, and I was privileged to be the guest speaker on the 100th anniversary. And so, yes, I have no problem in admitting that my grandmother was Ukrainian and Ashkenazim, and that my father was Sephardic. So, yes.
There is one Jewish congregation now.
One.
21 cemeteries. One synagogue, 21 cemeteries. So where do people get buried now?
No, we have one cemetery today, and it is the one in use. Let's put it bluntly. It's not a question of it's Sephardic or Spanish and Portuguese, or it's a traditional. We did have another one which was more of an English and German congregation, but that one isn't used anymore. Everybody's buried in the one cemetery today. But we go back. And one of the fascinating things was to find a cemetery that we have properly explored and have properly recorded with the earliest grave, a Gabe of 1672. And my friend Eli Gabe from Mikvah Israel tells me that was his ancestor. I can't tell him that I believe him, but another story.
He told me that the reason they have 21 cemeteries is not because they had such an enormous population, but because it was very difficult to go anywhere in Jamaica. So everybody wanted the cemetery to be close by to where they were. So
absolutely. And in fact, we go one step further. We do have a small couple of Christian cemeteries in which a small section of it were used for the purposes of burying Jews.
Okay. And now I want to turn my attention to Joan and to say to Joan, you did a great job of saying there were so many different points of view about everything that was going on. Is there any lesson from the whole story of the Gibraltar camp and the Jewish experience that you think would be important for people to know?
No, I don't. But I'd like to tell you exactly what I didn't have a chance to say. And this is this. The ulterior reason for these Polish Jews to be sent to Gibraltar camp was that there were a lot of Polish Jews getting stuck in Lisbon. Salazar would not allow these people to allow more than 200 Poles of any ethnic of any religion to be in Portugal. So the British and the Polish government in exile got together, and they wanted to get those useless Jews out, and so they can have Poles who could fight in the war come into and through Portugal over to Britain. So they sent them, so they arranged. Now this is how it happened. The Polish government in exile applied to the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They started correspondence with the British Foreign and Colonial Offices and the government of Jamaica. It yielded 220 entry permits for people to come into Jamaica, to be lodged in restricted conditions in temporary housing built for evacuees from Gibraltar. Now, these the prior arrangements, the government in exile had arrangements with the HISM to fund refugees all over the world. So what happened was, by December 1st, 1941, arrangements were in progress for them to embark. The correspondence from neither the Foreign Office nor the Polish government in exile provides any evidence that the refugees were, on their departure from Lisbon, warned that they would be sent to a camp and not given total freedom of movement in Jamaica. This is what caused their complaining, and it seems like they were ungrateful. They were not ungrateful to be alive, okay? They didn't know what was happening in Europe, but they didn't know exactly what they were doing and where they were going to go. And I have all of this information from a report, a study by Mr. Thomas Potworovsky, and I put it on my website so anybody who wants to can read the whole full article. My website is My Sister's Eyes, the name of my book. So
one last question, Joan.
No, may I add to that? Sorry,
yes.
Over 600 Jews were saved from the shore through that Gibraltar camp. It was the Polish Jews were the first use of the Gibraltar camp.
Yes. And then the Dutch came, and the Dutch also came. And when the Dutch, I read to you the report from Charles Jordan, who was from the JDC, but there was a Dutch press secretary who came to visit the camp. He had a very different opinion, and I will put excerpts from his report on my website as well, because we don't have time to go into all the details.
And Shula, again, may I interrupt to suggest that the use of the camp for the purposes of saving Jews from the shore is also a major activity that's kept us out of anti-Semitic understanding and belief.
Excellent. Ainsley, you are a rock star. People want to know your email.
Oh, my God. It's Ainsley, Ainsley, at cwjamaica.com.
Ainsley?
My first name and cwjamaica.com.
Okay, and I want to end.
My wife knows it.
Fine. There's so many great questions you cannot answer now. One was how many Jews were saved in Jamaica? How were the Jews chosen who went to Jamaica? How many children were there? And on and on and on, showing how much interest there is. But I would like to end my reading of the many, many chat questions and comments from Linda Aronofsky-Cox. She writes, "That is my mother, age about 11, in the front row of that picture you showed, Joan. Yes. Overwhelming to find this photo and see my own mother there."
And mine.
And yours. You're never far behind, Ainsley. And I think that's a nice lead into Mother's Day. So we have about 2 minutes. Do you want to make any brief final remark, Ainsley?
I think what's important is that we can boast today, and I shouldn't even say this publicly, but that anti-Semitism literally does not exist in Jamaica. And I am arguing that I think we're handling anti-Semitism generally around the world in the wrong context. But I'm not an expert. I just happen to live in a country where we don't have to face with it every day.
Okay, thank you.
I'll talk more about it if anybody ever wants.
Here's a secret. Ainsley's writing a book. To be able to read the whole story. I don't know when exactly, but soon. Joan, do you want to make a final comment?
I'd just like to show that picture, Michael. Can you just get the slide up, the last slide I have for you? Here are my parents, Hala and Ignaz, meeting old and new friends in Brighton Beach in February 1946, and that's me, their baby, their new baby, their replacement child, I found out later. But anyway, I never saw one iota of pain or anything in my mother's eyes. She loved me, they loved me, and I never knew the tragedy that they went through. They were beautiful, beautiful people.
When did you learn about it?
In 1956. Okay. Read my book, everybody, it's free.
I'll show it to you.
Yeah, that's the cover, My Sister's Eyes.
And there's a story about her sister's eyes. And now I want to say the floor is yours, Olivia, for the last bracha.
Great, but can you hold up the photo, the book again and say something, because that will bring you full screen so people can see Joan's book. You need to speak so that you're...
I'm speaking, okay. My sister's eyes, I'm sorry, refers to an incident where someone years later saw Joan in was it a swimming pool?
It was Bear Mountain State Park. I was 11 years old in 1956. I was, nobody cared about going into leaving their children alone. So I went to the pool by myself, and there was a man who looked at me. He wore a bathing suit like my father's, a European style. And then he called me over to the edge of the pool and he said, "Bring me to your father." And I said, I don't know this man, but he had a Polish accent. So I brought him to my father. They started hugging and kissing. And I said to my mother, "How did this man know that I was his friend's daughter?" She said to me, "You have your sister's eyes."
And that was the beginning of the story. And we're at the end of the hour. And I say goodbye, and I can't wait to be part of the audience next week.
Great. Well, another hour has flown by, and probably raised more questions than it answered, but at least it's opened a new subject for some people, I think, of how Jamaica was a safe haven from the time of the Inquisition until World War II, and how today there's no anti-Semitism, which is such a beautiful thing. Next week is Mother's Day, and we hope to see you all for our Mother's Day program. So have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you to my speakers, Ainsley Cohen Henriques, Joan Arnay Halperin, to our fabulous moderator, Professor Shulamit Reinharz. Thank you to our audience, and bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.